There is a ridge in Newton County, Arkansas, in the Boston Mountains, where every family that has lived there across the past 4 generations follows one rule. The rule has no written record, no sign marks it, no meeting was held to establish it, and yet every household on that ridge, without exception, follows it. You do not hunt past the second bluff line on the west end of the property. It does not matter what the season is. It does not matter how good the hunting has been or how slow. If a buck you have been watching all fall walks into that hollow ahead of you, you stop at the bluff line, you turn around, and you go home. The hollow below the second bluff belongs to something that was there before any of those families arrived. And it has held that claim with enough patience and enough consistency across 80-plus years that the families who live on that ridge stopped arguing with it before most of them were born. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. I spent 4 months working through this story. The first month was archival. The Newton County Courthouse records in Jasper, the Newton County Historical Society's collections of family histories and early settler accounts, the University of Arkansas special collections in Fayetteville, where the relevant portions of the Ozark National Forest's administrative history and the early Buffalo National River documentation are held. I pulled the Cherokee removal records for the territory, cross-referenced against Mooney's published fieldwork, and looked at the county-level hunting records and game and fish enforcement logs going back as far as the county maintained them, looking for any anomalous report that might have entered the institutional records sideways, under a category that fit the available taxonomy even when it fit imperfectly. I found nothing under the right category, which was not surprising. I found several things under the wrong category that I could not confirm as related, and that I do not include here. The second and third months were interviews, the correspondence that led to conversations, the conversations that led to follow-up calls, the process of building enough mutual understanding with people who are not inclined toward disclosure that they conclude the disclosure is worth the risk it carries. I spoke to the people who live by the rule and to a man from outside the Ridge community who got close enough to understand exactly why the rule exists. I reviewed the physical evidence that has accumulated on that property across 3 generations, photographs, a track cast, a bent trail camera bracket. I spoke to an elderly man who has heard the Dogman 3 times in 8 decades and who describes it as one describes the weather, not dramatically, just as a fact of the landscape they have always occupied. And I went through the historical record of the Boston Mountains, through the Cherokee oral traditions documented before and after the forced removal of 1838, through early settler accounts in the county archives in Jasper, looking for anything that placed the same thing in the same kind of ground further back than living memory reaches. What I found is something the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission does not have a category for, something the state's wildlife management system cannot process, and something that the families on that ridge have understood with a completeness that no institution shares. The family's understanding did not come from research or from the application of a theoretical framework. It came from living alongside the arrangement across generations, from the accumulated experience of people who had no reason to invest the arrangement with any significance beyond what the evidence of their direct experience required. Grover was not a man who wanted a mystery on his property. He was a farmer with 140 acres to work and a family to feed through an Ozark winter. And the hollow below the second bluff was terrain he would have used if using it had been possible. The rule was not chosen for its drama. It was chosen because the evidence made the alternative, going back into the hollow, clearly inadvisable. The rule is not superstition. It is the documented operating arrangement between a ridge community and a territorial intelligence that has held its end of the agreement for the better part of a century. Newton County sits in the northwest corner of Arkansas, a county of 835 square miles with fewer than 8,000 residents spread across its full extent. The county seat is Jasper, a town of around 500 people at the junction of Arkansas Highways 7 and 446, down in one of the narrow flat stretches along the Little Buffalo River. There are no stoplights in Newton County. The roads that leave the river valleys climb immediately into terrain that is steep and heavily wooded, and once you get far enough from the main paved routes, largely without the markings of contemporary American life. No cell service, no broadband, no traffic noise. The county is what the Ozarks looked like before the tourist economy found them, and the people who live here in the backcountry farms and the ridgetop properties tend to be people who find that circumstance agreeable rather than limiting. The hunting culture in Newton County is not recreational in the sense that hunting is recreational in most of the country. In most of the country, hunting is an activity people organize around other obligations, a few days in November booked months in advance, a lease paid by credit card, a truck loaded on a Friday after work and driven 4 hours to a stand that was scouted from aerial imagery on a phone screen. In Newton County, hunting is a production system. Families here have been feeding themselves from the surrounding forest for as long as the families have been in the county. And the practical knowledge that sustains that system, the knowledge of which hollows the deer use in the rut and which cedar breaks the turkeys roost in when the temperature drops and which creek crossings produce in the wet years, and which hold nothing in the dry ones, is transmitted from one generation to the next, with the same seriousness that a trade is transmitted. It is not folklore. It is operational information that people depend on.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
This context matters for understanding Cutter Ridge because the choice to leave 70+ acres of that ridge permanently unhunted is, in Newton County terms, a significant economic sacrifice with a practical cost that accrues every season. Deer that bed in the hollow below the second bluff line are unreachable. The hollow drains the moisture from the surrounding ridge timber, making the cedar breaks below the first bluff some of the most productive browse habitat on the property. In a county where deer are currency and where productive habitat is the physical foundation of a family's food supply across winter, the rule costs the Ridge families in real terms. Every generation that has followed it despite that cost, which tells you something about how seriously the knowledge behind the rule has been held. The Boston Mountains form the southern wall of the Ozark Plateau in this part of Arkansas, and Newton County holds some of the highest and most broken terrain in the range. The ridges above the valley floors push well above 2,000 feet in elevation. The hollows between those ridges drop 500 to 700 feet in the space of half a mile, through exposed limestone bluffs and dense cedar breaks and hardwood forests so thick that light barely reaches the ground on a summer afternoon. The Boston Mountains receive more rainfall than the plateau country to the north, in the range of 45 to 55 inches per year. And that moisture drives a forest density unusual for the Mid-South. Big timber on the ridge crests, dense understory in the draws, creek bottoms that hold water through most seasons and produce the kind of browse and hard mast that sustains one of the most productive white-tailed deer populations in the state. The Ozark National Forest covers a substantial portion of Newton County managed through the Buffalo Ranger District, which also oversees land adjacent to the Buffalo National River. The forest in Newton County is not the heavily managed plantation-style timber production forest of the commercial South. It is, in most of its extent, forest that has been allowed to return toward its pre-logging character over the centuries since the timber companies moved through a process that has produced a varied and ecologically complex landscape of second and third growth timber, recovering understory and, in the most remote drainages, pockets of old-growth character that the loggers found too steep or too remote to reach economically. The hollow terrain below the Cutter Ridge bluff lines is in this category. Too steep for equipment access, too remote from any road system to make the extraction cost-effective, and therefore largely untouched since the first settlers arrived. Whatever the hollow has been for the past 100 years, it has been without the regular human disturbance that most of the surrounding forest has absorbed. The Buffalo, designated in 1972 as the first national river in the United States, cuts east to west through the county, its limestone canyon dropping through 300 feet of sedimentary rock laid down in shallow seas 450 million years ago. The river corridor draws visitors every season, kayakers in spring when the water runs, hikers on the bluff-top trails year-round, photographers working the valley where the elk that were reintroduced to the upper Buffalo watershed beginning in 1981 have established a herd that now numbers in the hundreds. The elk are a conservation story the county is proud of, and rightly so. But the Boston Mountain ridges above the river canyon are a different world from the managed visitor experience of the national river. Trails end. County roads go from pavement to gravel to dirt and sometimes just stop, turning into old logging tracks that the forest has been quietly reclaiming for 50 years. The Boxley Valley in northern Newton County is one of the few genuinely flat stretches in this terrain, a farming valley enclosed by Boston Mountain ridges on most sides and drained by the headwaters of the Buffalo River. Families have worked the Boxley bottomland since before the Civil War, running cattle, cutting hay, hunting the surrounding ridges with a consistency that has made this valley one of the most intact examples of traditional Ozark agricultural life still functioning in the state. On cold mornings in winter, you can stand on the county road and watch elk grazing among the cattle in the bottomland fields. The gray limestone bluffs rising behind them, and the whole scene looks like something that should not still be possible in this century. The ridge I am writing about is north and west of that valley. I drove it once in late October with Leland's permission to understand the physical approach before I spoke to any of the witnesses. A county road leaves Highway 21 and climbs through switchbacks to the ridgetop, gaining nearly 1,000 feet of elevation in a little over 2 miles. The ridge runs roughly east to west, with the south face dropping steeply toward a tributary of Big Creek, and the north face declining more gradually toward the upper drainage of the Little Buffalo. On the ridgetop itself, the tree line opens into field grass in places where the soil layer is thin over the bedrock, and the rock stays too close to the surface for timber to take hold. In October, those open stretches give a view south across the Boston Mountains that goes for 30 miles on a clear day, ridge after ridge in every shade of yellow and orange and the dark, permanent green of the cedar. The ridges stacked against each other as if folded under pressure from below, which geologically is exactly what happened. The approach to the west end of the ridge was not difficult in the sense of technical terrain. It was difficult in the manner of a place that does not want you. I am aware of how that sounds, and I report it as accurately as I can. There is a quality to the west end timber that changes somewhere past the halfway point of the ridge, a quality I cannot quantify or attribute to any specific sensory input, but that produced in me a consistent physical awareness of being somewhere I was not intended to be. The timber was the same oak and hickory mix with cedar in the draws and limestone ledge exposed where the slope angle was steep enough to shed soil. The light was the same October light. The ambient sound of wind and distant crows was unchanged, and yet the aggregate of the place past a certain point on the ridge felt different from the east half of the same terrain. I noted it and did not linger. Below the south face, in a hollow that cuts between 2 limestone bluff lines before flattening out at a spring-fed pool, is the territory the rule protects. That pool has been there since before any human memory on this ridge. The spring that feeds it surfaces through a fracture in the limestone near the base of the second bluff. The water is cold in every season, Leland told me, in the manner that water coming out of deep rock is always cold regardless of the season above it. drawing its temperature from the limestone formation rather than from the air. The limestone flat beside the spring pool is shaded by white oak and red cedar for most of the day. In the afternoon, when the sun angle has dropped below the west rim of the hollow, the flat goes into deep shade while the bluff tops above it are still in full light. From the first bluff line, you can see that flat. On the morning I stood at the first bluff and looked down, it was empty. The pool reflected the gray October sky. The flat limestone beside it was dark with moisture from the night before. Whatever lives in that hollow was not visible. But I did not feel, standing at that bluff line in the cold light, that the hollow was empty in any deeper sense than the absence of visual confirmation. And whatever has claimed that hollow has arranged the terms under which anything else is allowed to use it. The man who agreed to talk with me is the third generation of his family on this ridge. He is in his late 50s. He runs a small cow-calf operation of around 60 head, cuts hay on the ridgetop fields in summer and hunts the east and north timber on his property as his father and grandfather did before him. He is not a man who seeks attention, and not a man who talks loosely. He agreed to this conversation after months of correspondence, and he agreed on the condition that his name not be used in any form that his neighbors or the Newton County hunting community could connect to him. The months of correspondence were themselves a kind of evaluation. He was assessing me the way someone with significant information assesses the person asking for it, watching for inconsistency between what I said in one exchange and what I said in another, for the quality of questions that reveal whether someone is approaching the material responsibly or approaching it for a kind of attention the material does not need. When we first spoke on the phone, he told me I asked the right kind of questions, which I took to mean questions that kept open the possibility of being wrong, rather than questions that assumed the most dramatic interpretation of every piece of evidence in advance. We will call him Leland. That is not his real name. His actual name would place him immediately in a county of fewer than 8,000 people, where the hunting community is small and tightly networked, and where reputations are built over decades and lost in conversations. He said placing his name on a Dogman account would cost him a standing in this community that he has spent his whole adult life building. So we call him Leland. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Now back to the story. Leland grew up on the ridge. He went to school in Jasper, worked in Fayetteville for a few years in his mid-20s, and came back to take over his father's cattle operation when his father's health started to decline. He has been running that operation for close to 30 years now. He knows the ridge and the surrounding forest with the knowledge a man builds from moving through the same ground every day of his adult life, not from maps or surveys, but from the physical experience of walking the same ground in every season, at every hour, in every weather. He knows which draws hold deer in the rut. He knows which bluff faces the turkeys roost on in cold weather. He knows the sound his cattle make when something has disturbed them at night and the sound they make when nothing has. He grew up with the rule the same way everyone on that ridge grew up with it. His father told him when he was old enough to hunt, "The West End is off limits. You don't go past the second bluff line. You don't push dogs into that hollow. You don't take clients or hunting partners in there. You leave it alone and it leaves you alone, and that is a better arrangement than any other one available to you." As a child, Leland accepted it without question, the way children accept the rules of the household they are born into. As a teenager, he began to wonder. As a young man home from Fayetteville with enough outside experience to make him skeptical of things he could not verify, he asked. His father's response was not an explanation. It was a placement of the question in a larger category. His father told him the rule had been on that ridge since before his grandfather's time, that every family on the ridge had arrived at it for reasons that were their own business, and that it had kept the peace for long enough that he did not see any reason to go looking for reasons to change it. Leland understood that his father was drawing a line. He accepted it as you accept lines drawn by people whose judgment you have learned to trust through the evidence of their lives. The process of settling his father's estate took the better part of 2 years. His father had not been a man who simplified things before he died, and what he left behind was the accumulated material of a life lived on the same property across 6 decades. Barn tools and fence wire and hay records going back to the 1970s, cattle registration papers, land survey copies, the correspondence of a man who had dealt with the county and the state and the Ozark National Forest Service on matters of boundary and easement and grazing right across 4 decades, medical records that Leland sorted and shredded with the help of his own doctor. A coin collection in a coffee can that turned out to be worth less than he had hoped, and photographs in shoe boxes that he could not bring himself to sort and instead placed in the attic intact to be dealt with by the generation after his own. He was in his early 40s, settling his father's estate and going through the house, when he found an old notebook in the back of a bedroom closet. His father had kept journals his whole adult life. Practical records, farming notes, weather observations, the kind of documentation a working man keeps as a matter of habit rather than sentiment. This notebook was older than the others and written in a different hand. Tucked inside its back cover was a loose page that was not part of the original notebook. The page was in his grandfather's handwriting. 170 words, maybe 200. And in those words, for the first time in his adult life, Leland had the explanation he had been waiting for since he was 17. His grandfather was named Grover. He appears in Leland's family history as a man of considerable competence and minimal sentiment, a Carroll County native who had grown up in the Ozarks during the years when the Boston Mountain Ridgeland was still being logged out by the big out-of-state timber companies, and when the cleared ground was either farmed or abandoned, depending on whether the family that took it had enough margin to survive the years before the soil proved what it would give. Grover had that margin, barely. Grover had come to the ridge in the late 1920s, buying land that had been logged out in the teens and abandoned by a family that could not make it pay after the timber companies moved on. He brought his wife and 2 young children. He was a farmer and a carpenter and a hunter who had grown up in Carroll County and knew Ozark country from the inside, from a lifetime spent within it, by the sound it makes before a storm, by the way deer move in the rut, by the particular silence of a forest that has gone wrong. He was, by every account his family kept of him, a practical man without a tendency toward drama. The notebook page records what happened in the fall of 1936, 8 years after Grover had settled on the ridge. He had been hunting the west end of the property since arriving, always stopping at the first bluff line out of a discomfort he described in the notebook as instinct he had not examined closely. It was the kind of instinct that hunters and woodsmen in that era did not discuss openly because the vocabulary for discussing it was not available to them. They were practical men of a practical culture, and they trusted physical sensation as information as you trust the sensation of loose footing before you look down to confirm it. Grover's language in the notebook was not dramatic. He wrote that the West End felt wrong in the particular way that a room feels wrong when you enter it and the person inside goes quiet. A social quality. Not the silence of a forest with nothing in it, but the silence of a forest that knows you are there and has made a decision about you. He wrote that the country below the first bluff did not feel occupied the way the rest of the ridge felt occupied, not by wildlife, which was plentiful on the slope above, but by something that gave the hollow below a quality he could not precisely name. He had gone as far as the first bluff on multiple occasions, and then turned back without knowing exactly why. In the fall of 1936, after a drought summer that had made the deer thin and the hunting slow, he needed the meat, and he pushed past the first bluff. He followed the slope down through the limestone ledge, through the cedar screen below it, and down the second bluff drop into the hollow floor. The hollow was deeper than it had appeared from above. The limestone walls on either side were high enough that the sky narrowed to a strip. The light at the bottom was dim and green even in the middle of a clear October afternoon, the sun angled too low to clear the bluff tops. He could hear the spring before he saw it. Water moving over limestone in the Boston Mountains has a particular low murmur that carries through a hollow with unexpected clarity. He came around the last cedar screen and found the pool. And he found what was at it. Grover's description in the notebook page is spare. He recorded facts as he recorded weather and cattle weights directly without commentary, trusting the facts to carry what they needed to carry. He was not a man who embellished, and the notebook page shows no embellishment. There are no flourishes of description, no reaching for dramatic language, no attempt to explain or contextualize the thing he saw before describing it. He simply wrote what was there, in the order he encountered it, in the plain declarative sentences of a man accustomed to recording livestock observations and weather events and fence repair notes. The plainness is itself significant. A man inventing a story for later readers writes with more detail toward the emotional response he wants them to have. Grover wrote as if he were writing only for himself, for the purpose of having a record, as a farmer writes down a soil observation that he does not yet know how to use but wants to be able to refer to later. He wrote that it was standing on two legs beside the pool, and that it was as tall as a man and a half or possibly taller, and that the shape of its head was wrong. He wrote that the head was like the head of a large dog but scaled to something much heavier and set on a neck and shoulders that belonged to a being of substantial mass. He wrote that it turned to look at him when he came through the cedars and that it did not run, did not charge, did not make any sound. He wrote that it regarded him in the manner of a landowner looking at a trespasser, patient, settled, waiting to see what he would do. He wrote that the thing did not move while he backed out. He wrote that he kept it in view for as long as he could, moving backward up the hollow slope as you keep something in view when you are not certain of your safety and turning around. At the cedar screen below the first bluff, he lost visual contact. He wrote that he did not hear anything behind him. He wrote that the hollow was entirely quiet except for the spring. He climbed back up through both bluff lines and crossed the ridge to his house and sat at his kitchen table and did not pick up his rifle again for the rest of that season. He did not write about what he thought it was. In the 170 or so words he committed to that notebook page, he described only what he saw and what he did. He did not speculate about species or origin or the nature of what he had encountered at the spring. This restraint is consistent with who the family record shows him to have been. He was a man who separated observation from interpretation, who noted what happened and left the interpretation for when he had enough information to do it responsibly. He never, as far as Leland's family record shows, added to that page. The page stands as the complete record of what Grover chose to commit to writing about that afternoon, what he thought about it in the decades he spent on that ridge afterward, what passed through him in the dark before sleeping or on the porch in the autumn evenings when the west end of the ridge was quiet, is not recorded. Only the observation and the rule that followed it. In the spring of 1937, Grover spoke to the other families on the ridge. There were 3 others at that time, all of them running cattle or hogs on the ridgetop land and hunting the surrounding terrain the way every family in Newton County hunted. He told them what he had found at the spring. He told them where it was and what he had seen. He said the hollow below the second bluff was held by something that had been there before any of them arrived, and that the fair and sensible thing to do was to leave it alone. 2 of the 3 families said they had always felt something wrong in that west end without being able to say exactly what it was. The third family said Grover had probably seen a large black bear and the October light had handled the rest. The October light point was reasonable on its own terms. The hollow terrain is the kind of terrain where light and shadow conspire against accurate perception, where a deer in the cedar shade can read as a large dark mass, and a large dark mass can read as almost anything depending on the angle and the brightness of the sky above the bluff line. Black bears were present in Newton County in the 1930s in numbers that have since declined and slowly recovered, and a large male black bear rearing to look is tall enough and wrong enough in its proportions to produce a confused visual impression at distance in failing light. Grover's account read in isolation could be filed under misidentification by someone inclined to file it there. The third family was so inclined. They reconsidered 3 weeks later. What happened to the fourth family is the account that Leland's neighbor Olin tells from family memory, having heard it as a child from his own grandfather, who heard it from the man it happened to. The fourth family, we will call them the Perlmans, which is not their name, had a son in his 20s who had always been confident in the woods, the kind of young man who takes pride in not being afraid of things, a quality that the Ozark terrain has a way of adjusting. This son, Wyatt, decided that what Grover had seen in the hollow was a bear, and that his neighbors were going to cost themselves good hunting ground over a frightened man's misidentification. He had been watching a large doe for 2 weeks. Her trail went down the hollow slope, and he intended to follow it. Wyatt went into the hollow on a Thursday morning in March of 1937 with 3 hounds he had raised himself. Good dogs that had run deer and coyote in every kind of Ozark terrain without hesitation. He worked his way down the south face, through the first bluff, down through the cedar screen, and over the second bluff drop into the hollow floor. He found the spring just where Grover had described it, and he found his dogs. The 3 hounds were laid out on the flat limestone beside the spring, in a row, side by side, spaced evenly from each other and from the water. They were not dead. Their sides were moving. But they were not conscious. They lay with their legs straight and their eyes open, and they did not respond to Wyatt's voice or to his hand on their flanks. He checked each one. No wounds, no blood, no injury he could find anywhere on their bodies. They were breathing steadily, but they were in a state he could not account for, and the flat ground around the spring was empty, and the hollow was quiet with a stillness Wyatt later described, in the only account he ever gave of that morning, as the worst he had ever experienced in his life. He got the dogs back up the bluff as best he could, partly carrying them, partly coaxing. The animals came to consciousness gradually as he moved them up the slope, as an animal comes out of deep sedation. First the eyes moving, then the limbs, then the uncertain attempt at coordination. By the time he had them over the first bluff, 2 of them were walking on their own, unsteady but functional. They did not want to go back down the slope. He did not push them. He got them back to the farm in the bed of his truck and gave them water and watched them through the evening. 2 of them recovered fully by evening. The third never hunted again. Something had broken in it that no vet could identify. It spent its remaining years on the porch and died there without having run in the field again. Wyatt never said publicly what he believed had happened in the hollow. He followed the rule for the rest of his life, and his family has followed it since. The Perlman property has changed hands twice since Wyatt's time. Both times, the family selling made the rule explicit to the buyer, not in the paperwork, not as a legal covenant, but in conversation, the way knowledge that matters in a small community gets transmitted between people who understand each other. Every owner of that land since 1937 has followed the rule. Leland said the only time he has seen it not followed was a period of about 2 years in the late 1980s when the property went through an estate dispute and was temporarily managed by a party from out of the area who had not received the full account. During those 2 years, the west end of the property was hunted once by a group the out-of-area party brought in from northwest Arkansas. Leland heard the shots from his ridge and knew immediately what had happened. He spoke to the out-of-area party the following week and gave the account as completely as he could without naming names or places that would identify the specific witness records. The out-of-area party listened and acknowledged the information and that he would pass it along. The estate dispute resolved within the year. The next owner received the full account and has followed the rule without exception since. Leland does not know what happened to the hunting party who went into the West End during those 2 years. They came in loud and left quiet, and he did not ask. The current owners, a family who moved from out of the county and have been there about 15 years now, were told the rule at the closing. Leland said he was present for part of that conversation and watched the previous owner's daughter take the new buyer aside in the courthouse parking lot in Jasper and speak quietly to him for about 3 minutes. When she was done, his expression had shifted not to fear but to the careful attentiveness of someone who has just received information they understand they should take seriously. Leland had watched enough of those conversations over the years to recognize the moment when the information crossed. There is a quality of attention that comes over a person when they have received information they cannot put into a category they already have, when the information requires them to make a new category rather than filing it into an existing one. The man in the courthouse parking lot had that quality when the previous owner's daughter finished speaking. He was not a man who showed his interior readily. He was from outside the county and carried himself with the reserve of someone accustomed to transactions where showing your interior was a disadvantage. But the parking lot conversation broke through that reserve not by frightening him, Leland thought, but by putting him in the position of taking seriously what he had not anticipated taking seriously, which is its own kind of disruption. He nodded. She nodded. That was the transfer. The 4 properties on the ridge have changed in composition over the decades as rural land does, through death and inheritance and occasional sale when a family line ends. But the rule has traveled with the land every single time. The 4 properties on the ridge have changed in composition over the decades the way rural land does, through death and inheritance and occasional sale when a family line ends. But the rule has traveled with the land every single time. What is notable and what makes the Cutter Ridge case different from a single family's oral tradition is that the rule has transferred across buyers who had no prior relationship with the Ridge community, who came from different backgrounds and different counties, who approached the purchase as a business or lifestyle decision, and received the rule as an addendum they had not anticipated. Every one of them has followed it. That is not because the rule sounds reasonable when explained. It is because the explanation is sufficiently specific, sufficiently grounded in the testimony of people the buyer can see and assess in real time, to make not following it seem foolish rather than prudent. The neighbor Leland speaks of most is the man we will call Olin. Olin has lived on his property on the ridge since the year he was born. His grandfather built the house he still lives in, a 2-story frame house with a metal roof and a porch that faces east, away from the hollow. He is in his middle 80s. He was in the Army briefly in the early 1960s, stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And he came back to the ridge after his service and has not left it for any extended period since. He is sharp-minded and slightly suspicious of anyone he does not already know, a quality that most people in isolated rural communities develop over time as a reasonable adaptation to the social landscape they inhabit. His Carroll County Ozark accent is unchanged from how he spoke as a young man, because the community around him has not changed enough to change it. He did not mind the word suspicious. A man who is not careful about who he trusts on a ridge that far from anything has not been paying attention. He gave me 2 months of correspondence before agreeing to talk, and that at the end of those 2 months he had a sense of who I was that he trusted enough to proceed. If his sense of who I was turned out to be wrong, he would know what to do about that afterward. I took this as a statement of fact rather than a threat, and I believe it was intended that way. He agreed to speak with me on the condition that nothing in his account be specific enough for his neighbors to identify him. He had spent his entire life not having trouble with what lived in that hollow and had no intention of inviting it at his age. He would tell me what he knew because he thought it was worth being known, but the telling had to be handled carefully. He agreed to speak with me on the condition that nothing in his account be specific enough for his neighbors to identify him. He had spent his entire life not having trouble with what lived in that hollow and had no intention of inviting it at his age. He would tell me what he knew because he thought it was worth being known, but that the telling had to be handled carefully, and he trusted me to handle it that way. Olin's grandfather knew Grover. They were contemporaries on the Ridge and participants in the same small social world that the Ridge families formed across the early and middle decades of the last century. Ridge communities in that era were more socially cohesive than they would later become, not because people were more sociable by nature, but because the practical demands of farming and logging and road maintenance in rough terrain required cooperation that the post-war agricultural economy would eventually make unnecessary. You needed your neighbors in ways that went beyond preference. A man who fell and broke a leg clearing his timber had neighbors who finished the clearing. A family whose barn burned in December had neighbors who helped them house the cattle through winter. The reciprocity was not sentimental. It was structural, built into the economics of the place, and it produced a social closeness and a level of mutual knowledge that people who grew up in that era tend to describe when they get old enough to understand what they had, with a mixture of pride and grief. Olin's grandfather was not, as far as the family record shows, one of the 3 families Grover consulted in the spring of 1937. He came to his understanding of the hollow through his own experience, before Grover made his account known, and that experience is the first of 3 events Olin describes from 8 decades on the Ridge. Olin said his grandfather had a word for what lived in the hollow that was not in English. He could not reproduce it for me and was not sure he should try. He said an old man in the community, a man of indeterminate origin and considerable age who had been on the Ridge before any of the named families, had used the word occasionally, and that Olin's grandfather had understood from context what it meant without ever having it defined directly. It described a territorial presence, a being associated with a specific piece of ground, associated specifically with water sources deep in the hollow bottoms, and treated by the people who knew about it as something that had been there longer than human memory could reach. The first event Olin describes happened when he was 11 years old, in the fall of what he believes was around 1951 or 52. He was sitting on his grandfather's porch after dark, the way children in that country used to sit on porches after dark in the years before television made the inside of the house more appealing than the outside. His grandfather was in the rocking chair. The night was clear and cold, and the Ridge was quiet in the way it gets in October when the leaves are mostly down and the wind can move through without resistance. Then the hollow started making a sound. Even at 11 years old, sitting on his grandfather's porch in the dark of an October evening, Olin knew the sounds the Ridge made at night. He had been hearing them his whole life. He knew the sound of the screech owls that worked the hollow edges from September through March. Their long descending wail that sounds to people who grew up in cities disturbingly human, and that sounds to people who grew up in places where screech owls are common, like exactly and only itself. He knew the sound of coyotes working the ridge in sequences, the single locating bark, the answering calls from other points, the group howl that would sometimes build for 30 seconds and then cut off as suddenly as it had started, leaving the ridge in a silence that always felt more complete after the noise than before it. He knew the great horned owls on the north face and the sound of a white-tailed buck in the rut pushing through brush on the ridge margin. He knew what the wind did in the cedar and what it did in the hardwoods and the difference between the two. He had, at 11, a catalog of night sounds large enough that he could sit on that porch and identify most of what he heard without thinking about it. He could not describe it precisely, and he said he would not try because any description he gave would flatten it into more familiar territory than it actually occupied. He said it was low. He said it came in long sequences separated by silence, each sequence slightly different from the one before it in ways that sounded organized, patterned, rather than random, the way speech is patterned rather than the way a coyote's call is patterned. He said it carried across the ridge without diminishing, which is not how sound normally behaves in forested terrain at distance. He said it did not sound like anything he has been able to identify in the 70 years since. His grandfather stood up from the rocking chair when it started, went inside without a word, came back with a bolt-action rifle and sat back down with the rifle across his knees and said nothing for as long as the sound continued, which was close to 20 minutes. When it stopped, the grandfather sat for another 10 minutes in silence, the rifle still in his lap, looking toward the west end of the ridge. Then he set the rifle inside the door and sat back down and rocked and eventually said, "It's letting us know it's there. It does that sometimes." That was the complete statement. Everything his grandfather said that night about the sound from the hollow. 11 words. Olin had been expecting more. He had been expecting the kind of explanation that adults give children when a frightening thing has happened and the adult wants to reassure and contextualize. His grandfather gave none of that. What he gave instead was a description of the sound's communicative function and an implicit instruction about how to receive it. You sit and you listen and you wait until it is done. You do not run. You do not shout back. You do not retreat to the house and lock the door. You sit in the chair with the rifle across your knees, and you give the message the attention it is asking for because the message is not a threat. It is a report. The grandfather understood that distinction and communicated it in those 11 words as clearly as it can be communicated. It lets us know it's there. It does that sometimes. Olin said he has thought about that sentence for 70 years, and the longer he has thought about it, the more information he finds in it. The creature was communicating. That was the grandfather's understanding. Not vocalizing in the way an animal vocalizes to establish a territorial claim or locate a mate, but communicating, sending a message to the occupied ridge above its hollow that it was still present and that the arrangement was still in effect. The grandfather's response was not fear. It was the same measured attentiveness you would bring to a neighbor who called out from across the fence line. Acknowledgement, patience, and the willingness to wait until the message was complete. The rifle was for contingencies. The sitting was for the understanding that what was happening in the hollow was not a threat. It was a report. Olin heard the hollow for a second time in his mid-30s in the fall of 1973. He was alone on the ridge that night, his wife and Jasper with her sister, his children young enough to be asleep early. He had been on the ridge for over a decade as an adult by that point, in the years when the ridge community was in one of its quieter periods, a stretch of ordinary seasons marked by ordinary events. The county roads had been improved somewhat with state money. Several younger families had moved off the ridge to take work in Jasper or Harrison or further south in Fayetteville. The ridge itself had been getting quieter year by year, and as rural communities in that era were all getting quieter, as the economic logic that had held small farming communities together began to dissolve in the decades after the war. Olin had stayed. He had the land and the cattle and the knowledge of how to run both. And he had Leora. And staying was what made sense. He was not a man who grieved the departure of the modern world from his particular ridge, but he noticed the silence it left. He was on the porch after supper when the hollow began again. This second event was longer than what he remembered from his childhood and more internally organized. There were patterns within the sequences that repeated, specific arrangements of tones coming back around after other arrangements, the way a recurring phrase comes back in a piece of music. He listened for the full duration, close to half an hour, and when it stopped he went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while. He was not frightened. He had grown up with the rule. He had known what was in the hollow since before he could put a name to it. What he felt that night was something closer to the awareness of being in the presence of something much older than himself, and much more settled in its knowledge of the place they both occupied. It was like sitting in a room with someone who has lived in the same house for 100 years, and who does not need to explain anything to you because everything about the house already explains it. The third time was in the fall of 2008. He was 68. His wife Leora was inside the house. He was finishing late work in his barn, a clear October night, the kind the Boston mountains produce in autumn when the air off the high ridges carries no warmth at all and goes straight through you. He heard the hollow start. He set down his tools and walked to the barn door and stood in the opening and listened. This time was different from the other two, and the difference was in the location of the sound. The previous times it had come from somewhere deep in the hollow, from the lower ground near the spring, audible but distant. This time it was closer. It was on the hollow side of the first bluff, at the boundary rather than from the interior, as if whatever was making it had moved to the edge of its territory and was making its announcement from there. He stood in the barn door for the full duration and said nothing. The barn had its own sounds, the cattle shifting in their stalls, the particular creak of old timber under the temperature change that comes after midnight in an Ozark October, the drip of water from the barn roof's edge onto the packed earth outside. All of those sounds were still present. He could hear them. But they were present as individual instruments are present underneath a chord that is louder and fuller than any of them separately. The hollows sound large enough to contain the smaller sounds without eliminating them. He stood in that containment for the full duration. When it stopped, the silence that followed was, in his words, the most complete silence he had ever experienced in 80-plus years on that ridge. He went inside and told Leora. In over 50 years of marriage, it was the first time he had told her about what the hollow's voice sounded like, and he told her because he was not entirely certain that night that what had moved to the bluff line was going to stay there. It stayed there. Nothing came above the second bluff. The following morning he walked the boundary at the first bluff and found nothing he could photograph. He went back to work, but he told me that from 2008 on he pays attention to where the sound originates when it comes, and to which direction it seems to be orienting. The third time, it felt less like an announcement and more like an inventory, like something taking stock of what was on the ridge and confirming that the accounting was current. Leland had placed his first trail camera in the hollow in the fall of 2012. He was in his early 50s. His son Cody had pushed him toward it after coming back to the ridge for a few weeks before returning to Fayetteville, where he was working construction management. Cody had grown up with the rule. He had been told there was something in the hollow but had never been given a complete account. He read his great-grandfather Grover's notebook page and sat with it, and then asked Leland directly, "Can we put a camera in and find out what is actually there?" "Maybe it was a large bear," he said. "Maybe it was a wolf hybrid that had moved into the territory." The family had been treating 70 acres of its own property as permanently off-limits based on an old man's handwritten account from the Depression era, and a few incidents since then. and he wanted to know if the restriction was still warranted. Leland thought about it for about a week. The argument was reasonable. A trail camera was not a hunt. It required no person to enter the hollow. You positioned the camera, you left it, you pulled the card. If the footage showed nothing unusual, if the hollow turned out to be ordinary habitat that the family had been unnecessarily avoiding for 8 decades, better to know that. He agreed to 1 camera, 1 placement, 1 cycle. He chose a tree on the slope just inside the first bluff drop. A large white oak on a line that gave the lens a clear field of view down toward the hollow floor and the spring. He mounted the camera at chest height, adjusted the angle, and walked back to the ridge. The camera had a motion sensor, an infrared emitter, a 2-week battery, and a 16-gigabyte card. He left it on a Friday evening in October. On the 12th day, he went back to retrieve the card. The camera was still on the tree. The housing appeared intact. The card was in the slot. But the camera was no longer aimed at the slope. It was pointed upward at the underside of the oak's canopy, the lens looking into the leaves 40 feet above. The mounting bracket, a steel plate with a strap tightened by a thumb screw, was bent. The steel had been deformed upward, the bracket pushed in a direction that would require significant force applied from below to the camera body. The strap was scuffed on its inner surface in a way consistent with being gripped by something hard enough to leave marks on hardened metal. He brought the card back to the house and reviewed the footage on his laptop. Most of the 12 nights showed ordinary wildlife, deer moving through at various hours, a raccoon spending time at the base of the camera tree, a black bear crossing the frame on the second night, heading toward the hollow floor unhurried. Standard Boston Mountain wildlife, the same species his other cameras across the ridge timber captured regularly. Then the 7th night, in the early hours of the morning. The infrared clip showed the empty slope first. Leland spent 20 minutes with the footage before he allowed himself to form any conclusions, running through the early segments twice to establish what was ordinary before he committed himself to what was not. This is the discipline of a man who has worked with trail cameras for years and who knows how the brain fills in the gaps between what infrared captures and what it implies. The early segments were unambiguous in their ordinariness. Pale gray ground cover, cedars on the right side of the frame, the open ground between the trees where the trail descended toward the spring. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then something entered from the lower left edge of the frame, moving uphill toward the camera from the direction of the spring. The first thing Leland registered was the height. There was a cedar in the left foreground that he knew by sight, a cedar whose crown was roughly 12 feet off the ground. Whatever entered the frame from below cleared most of that cedar. The figure was upright, bipedal, moving with the level stride of something that travels on 2 legs as a matter of normal locomotion. The shoulders in the infrared were wide, not the proportionate width of a tall man, but the width of something that carries substantial mass across the chest and through the shoulders at a scale outside human proportion. The arms hung longer than they should have, the hands below the level of the hips in the swing of a walking stride. At about 30 yards from the camera, the figure stopped. The stop was not a freeze, not the sudden halt of an animal that has detected an unexpected stimulus and gone rigid in threat assessment. It was the stop of something that had decided to stop, a voluntary deceleration to stillness, as someone stops walking when they have arrived where they intended to arrive. It turned toward the lens. Leland said that on his first viewing he could see 2 points of amber light reflecting the infrared emitter, the eye shine of a large nocturnal predator. Then the head tilted, a few degrees to the right. That tilt was the moment the clip shifted from frightening to a territory he could not place in any category he had available. The tilt was not an alarm response. It was not a threat display. It was a working through motion, intentional and careful, directed at the camera as if the figure were examining the device and forming an assessment of what it was and what it was doing in the hollow. After a few seconds, the figure closed the remaining distance. At close range, a hand, 5 fingers articulated, applying grip, reached up and contacted the camera body. The image lurched upward and settled on a view of the oak canopy. The clip ended. Leland did not put another camera in the hollow. He did not remove the bent bracket from the oak immediately. He left it there for 2 weeks, going back to look at it twice, spending time at the bluff line with the bent steel in his hands, running his thumb over the scuff marks on the strap where a hard grip had been applied. The steel was not aluminum. It was the kind of bracket sold for mounting heavy equipment in outdoor applications, rated for significant load, not the kind of thing you bend by casual contact. He showed it to nobody. He put it in the barn on a shelf where it has been since. He told Cody what the card had shown. Cody watched the clip and was quiet for a long time. He watched it twice. Then he watched the first 7 nights of ordinary footage, the deer and the raccoon and the black bear establishing for himself the same baseline Leland had established before looking at night 7. Leland sat at the kitchen table and waited. Cody went through it methodically as he approached most problems without rushing his conclusions. Then he asked whether a bear could have produced the bracket damage. Leland said he had spent 2 days thinking about that question before Cody asked it. A bear that could reach the bracket at that height would have knocked the camera down entirely, or chewed the housing or ripped the strap through the bark in the random way bears damage outdoor equipment. It would not have pushed the camera body upward with enough precision to bend the steel mounting plate in a specific direction without disturbing the rest of the setup. Cody accepted that. He sat with the clip for another day and then said, "The rule stands." Leland said yes, the rule stands. Cody went back to Fayetteville. He has not asked about the hollow again in the years since, and Leland takes that silence as its own kind of statement. Some things you absorb and stop pulling on the thread of. The man who came to Cutter Ridge from outside the community in the fall of 2013 without knowledge of the rule and without the accumulated context of 3 generations of warnings and accommodations was a hunting guide who had been working Newton County terrain for around 15 years. He had come to guiding after a decade in construction and a stretch of farming that did not work out. And he had discovered in his late 30s that the knowledge he had built up in a lifetime of hunting the Boston Mountains was commercially transferable. He was good with clients. He was patient with people who did not know the terrain, who needed instruction on stand discipline and wind direction and the difference between a deer on food and a deer in transition. And he did not make them feel stupid for not knowing what he knew. He understood that what he was selling was access to a forest he knew like the inside of his own house, and he sold it with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are not bluffing. His name for the purposes of this account is Cordell. He ran a small guiding operation out of Jasper, taking clients into the private and public land of Newton County and the surrounding counties for white-tailed deer and wild turkey. He was good at his work. He knew the land, knew deer behavior in Boston mountain terrain specifically, and had a reputation for producing animals for his clients. He was the kind of guide whose clients come back year after year because the experience delivers. He approached the property to the northwest of Leland's for bow season access. The owners agreed, but told him the east and north portions of the property only. The west end was off limits. They said it the way that rule gets communicated on that ridge, directly without elaboration in a tone that communicates the question is closed. Cordell said he understood and left it there. For 3 weeks he worked the east and north timber with his clients and found good deer. The west boundary was always there in his peripheral awareness. the cedar break below the first bluff, a line he could see from certain stand positions, darker against the autumn hillside than the hardwood timber on either side of it. He had no reason to push west. Then one of his clients, a businessman from Little Rock who had been hunting the Ozarks for nearly a decade and who held his own judgment in high regard, hit a buck that ran south across the ridge and over the west edge and into the hollow. The client tracked the blood trail. It went over the ridge and into the cedar and over the first bluff. He wanted to follow it. In Arkansas, a hunter who mortally wounds an animal has a legal and ethical obligation to attempt retrieval, and the client knew this and used it. He said he was not leaving his deer. Cordell told him they needed permission. The client said the deer would be beyond recovery by the time they got permission. Cordell got enough cell signal on the high point of the ridge to call the property owners. He explained the situation. There was a pause, and then the owner said they could go to the first bluff line and look, but that Cordell should not take his client below that line under any circumstances. Not in any situation. He was very clear about that last part. Cordell and his client walked to the first bluff. The blood trail continued over the edge and down the slope. Cordell glassed the terrain below from the bluff top before stepping any further. This was habit for him, developed over 15 years of guiding in country where you could be 100 yards from a wounded buck and not see it until it moved. He glassed methodically, left to right, working from the near slope down to the hollow floor. Through his binoculars, Cordell could follow the blood trail 60 or 70 yards down the cedar screen before it disappeared into the dense cover near the hollow floor. He scanned the flat ground at the bottom. He could see the edge of the spring pool. He could see the limestone flat beside it in the low angle of the afternoon light. And in the shadow of the cedar line, at the far edge of what the binoculars could resolve, he could see something standing. It was not fully visible. It was in deep shade, and he was looking into the shadowed side of a Boston mountain hollow from the bright ridge above, which puts everything in the shade at a disadvantage. He had encountered this optical problem before many times, glassing for deer in the shadow of a ridge face from an elevated position in full afternoon sun. The iris adjustment required is significant and slow, and detail in the shade resolves gradually rather than immediately. He held the binoculars steady and gave his eyes time to work. But the shape was there. Upright, too tall for a deer, too wide at the shoulder for a bear rearing to look. The head, and this was the detail he was most certain of, because the head was in the clearest relative light, was wrong. The profile of the head was canine, not the round skull of a bear, an elongated muzzle projecting forward from a skull that was too large, with the silhouette of ears standing upright from the crown. It was looking at them. He could not confirm eyes at that distance and in that light, but the angle of the head was directly toward the bluff line where he and his client were standing. It had known they were there. It had been in the cedar shade watching them come to the bluff while they were still tracking the blood trail on the open ridge above. Cordell told his client the deer had not made it, that the blood trail had gone cold, and that they were leaving. His client argued for several minutes. Cordell did not change his position. He used the voice that meant discussions were finished. The voice clients quickly learned meant what it said. He and his client walked back to the truck and drove down the ridge to the county highway, and neither of them said much on the drive back to Jasper. I spoke to Cordell on the phone for close to an hour. We spoke on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and I could hear wind in whatever trees were outside wherever he was, and the occasional sound of a dog settling in a bed somewhere in the room. He had moved his guiding operation to the Ouachita Mountains in Polk County by then, working terrain south of Mena, and had added taxidermy work to supplement his income. The Ouachita country was good country, he said, different from the Boston Mountains in character, lower and broader and with a different timber mix but productive. He had learned it in the years since he left Newton County with the same methodical patience he had applied to the Boston Mountains. He was doing all right. He meant it in the practical sense, enough work and enough money in a manageable situation rather than the emotional sense. He missed the Boston Mountain deer country. It was the best whitetail habitat in the state, he said, and he would go back tomorrow if not for what he had seen through those binoculars. Some things get duller with years and some get clearer, and what he had seen through the binoculars on that bluff line had gotten clearer, not duller, in the years since. The sharpness had not decreased. The figure in the cedar shade was as precise in his memory as it had been in the moment. The head profile distinct against the lighter limestone of the hollow wall behind it. The stillness that was not the stillness of an animal waiting but of an intelligence that had already decided what to do and was waiting for the other parties to reach the same conclusion. He had held binoculars in a lot of different field settings over 15 years of guiding, and he had never seen anything through them he could not identify. He was a man whose professional identity was built on the premise that the natural world could be learned, and that the things in it had names and behaviors you could know and work with. What he had seen through the glass did not have a name in his working vocabulary, and the absence of a name for something he had seen with his own equipment in his own hands was still working through him. The thing that stayed with him was not the size or the head shape. It was the stillness. The figure in the shade had been motionless for the entire time he had his binoculars on it, 3 or 4 minutes without altering its position or its attention once. It stood there with the patient stillness of an entity that had nothing to fear from their presence at the bluff line, that understood the bluff line represented a boundary they would not cross, and that was waiting for them to confirm that understanding and leave. The word that came to him on the drive back to Jasper was not monster, not predator. The word that came to him on the drive back to Jasper was not monster, not predator. The word that came to him was landlord, not a metaphor he had reached for deliberately. Not a comparison he had worked out through reflection. A word that simply arrived as the right word arrives when you have been searching for a frame and the frame finds you. It stood there as a landlord stands when tenants have wandered into the wrong unit and need a moment to understand that. It had known they would come to the bluff line. It had already positioned itself where they would see it when they arrived in the shade that gave it the advantage. At a distance that communicated that it was not concealing itself but not closing the gap either. The positioning was not the positioning of an animal that has been surprised. It was the positioning of an intelligence that had known they were coming and had decided in advance how to handle the situation. Cordell said he has thought about that positioning many times in the years since. A landlord who knows the tenant is coming before the tenant gets there, and who has already arranged themselves in the posture that makes the message clear before a word is spoken. If you have ever driven Highway 21 north through the Boxley Valley and continued toward Ponca, or if you have hunted any of the public ground in the Ozark National Forest above the Buffalo River Canyon in Newton County, you know the kind of terrain I am describing. That combination of limestone and cedar and the particular silence that comes from being far enough off any road that traffic noise is completely gone, that is what the Boston Mountain Hollows feel like from the inside. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there or anywhere in the Boxley area, because the reports I have been going through from this drainage go back a long way before this one ridge. The material record from Cutter Ridge spans 87 years from Grover's notebook page to the present. It is one of the longer continuous multi-witness records associated with a single territory in the available Dogman literature, and its length is part of what makes it analytically valuable. A record that extends across 9 decades and multiple families in both first-person witnesses and transmitted family accounts is not susceptible to the explanations that work for shorter records. A single witness's account can be attributed to misidentification or stress or the distortions of memory across time. A family's transmitted account can be attributed to how oral traditions accumulate embellishment and shorten toward narrative convenience. A community tradition that spans 4 unrelated households and transfers across property sales to buyers with no prior knowledge of it is harder to reduce to any of these. Across that span, the record includes one first-hand written account by the original ridge settler, the immediate aftermath account involving the Perlman family's hunting dogs, 3 separate vocal events described in detailed and consistent terms by a single multi-generational witness, 1 trail camera clip showing a large bipedal figure interacting with the camera equipment, 1 visual observation at distance by an experienced outdoorsman using optical equipment, a pattern of vocalizations that multiple witnesses across multiple generations have described in sufficiently similar terms to suggest the same source, and a material event in 2019 involving a coyote carcass placed at a property boundary in a manner that can only be described as intentional communication. That last item requires its own discussion. In the summer of 2019, the family on the Northwest property had been dealing with a coyote raiding their chicken operation. A single animal based on track evidence, running the ridge margin intermittently. They had lost a number of chickens over several months. The husband had tried trapping without success. In the first week of October, the raid stopped, and on the morning of October 12th, Leland found a dead coyote at the base of the fence post that marks the property line at the top of the first bluff. The coyote was on the ridge side of the fence, placed against the post from the hollow side. Placed is the word that matters. The neck was broken. The animal was laid flat against the post, head pointing uphill toward the ridge, parallel to the fence line. There were no drag marks on the ridge grass, no blood on the ridge soil. Whatever had killed it had brought it up from the hollow and set it at the boundary. Leland called the property owners and described what he had found. The wife was quiet for a moment and then said she knew which coyote that was. She had been watching its tracks for 2 months. She said she was glad they would not have to relocate the chickens. Then she was quiet for a longer moment and she said, "It knows our chickens are there." And Leland said yes. It knows everything on this ridge. He has thought about that exchange many times in the years since, about the weight of what they were both accepting in that short conversation. 2 neighbors on a Boston mountain ridge, one speaking from a house that had been in her husband's family for 3 generations. Acknowledging over the telephone that an intelligence in the hollow below the ridge had been monitoring their property closely enough to identify a specific predation problem in their livestock operation, had waited for the problem to resolve on its own, and when it had not, had resolved it. Not as an act of charity or goodwill in any human legible emotional sense, as a maintenance of the relationship, as the kind of neighbor management that any landowner performs when a stray dog from a neighboring property has been in the field. You deal with it because your neighbor's problem is adjacent to your territory, and because the arrangement you share with your neighbor requires a functioning baseline on both sides of the line. It knows everything on this ridge. 4 words that the families on Cutter Ridge have been living inside for nearly 90 years. Whether or not any of them would have chosen that phrasing before that particular October morning. The territorial intelligence demonstrated by that single event is more significant than any of the dramatic encounter material. The trail camera clip shows a large bipedal figure with canine anatomy interacting with technology in a manner consistent with curiosity and problem solving. The track circuit at the stock pond implies spatial familiarity with the ridge properties at a level of detail that goes beyond occasional passage. The vocal events Olin describes across 8 decades suggest ongoing communication directed at the ridge community with a consistency that implies the relationship is maintained actively rather than passively. All of these are significant. But the coyote at the fence post is different in kind from all of them, because it shows the dogman not simply responding to the ridge family's actions, but initiating an action on their behalf without having been asked and without any communication between the parties that preceded it. The dogman in the Cutter Ridge Hollow is not simply occupying a piece of ground and tolerating the presence of humans nearby. It is maintaining the shared boundary as an active participant. It monitors the ridge above its territory. It is aware of what lives there, the cattle, the chickens, the people, the dogs. It knows which animals belong to the ridge families and which do not. It removed a problem from the ridge family's space and communicated that removal through a placement that was unambiguous in its meaning. The coyote was delivered to the boundary, ridge side, against the post in a posture that made clear it had been brought there deliberately. The message was not a threat. The message was, I took care of this. The arrangement holds. That kind of bilateral awareness maintained across decades of proximity without a single incident of violence directed at any person or any piece of ridge livestock implies a level of social cognition that puts the Cutter Ridge dogman outside any behavioral model developed for known North American predators. Social cognition in the biological literature refers to the cognitive processes that allow an individual to understand and respond to the mental states and intentions of others and to maintain stable social arrangements across time. It includes the capacity to attribute goals and beliefs to other individuals, to predict their behavior based on those attributed states, and to maintain a relationship with a neighboring party across months and years, and the turnover of personnel that comes with generational change. In its most developed forms, it includes the ability to understand what another party needs, to act on their behalf without being asked, and to communicate that action through a chosen gesture, a placement, a sign at the boundary that the other party will recognize and correctly interpret. The coyote at the fence post requires all of those capacities in the party that placed it. Wolves understand territorial boundaries shared with other packs. Bears show sophisticated spatial memory. Coyotes learn human routines with remarkable speed. But none of these species has been documented to maintain a decades-long bilateral territorial arrangement with a neighboring human community that includes intentional communication across the shared boundary, monitoring of the neighbor's livestock situation, and management of predator conflicts that threaten the neighbor's animals. What the Cutter Ridge record describes is something operating at a different cognitive level than any of these. Something that is thinking about the relationship with the ridge families, not merely tolerating them. What I keep returning to in the Cutter Ridge material is the temporal span of the consistency. Individual encounters showing restraint are documented in dozens of cases across the Great Lakes and Appalachian Dogman records. A single encounter in which a creature warns rather than attacks and then allows the human to leave is striking on its own terms. What the Cutter Ridge record contains is not that. It contains nearly 90 years of interactions across varying personnel, varying circumstances, varying seasons and decades, and the substantial social and technological changes that have occurred in Newton County across that span. And the behavioral signature across all of it has not shifted. The behavioral pattern holds across every incident in the record. When Grover backed out of the hollow in 1936, the dogman let him leave. When Wyatt's dogs came in 1937, they were subdued but not killed. A warning calibrated to be clear without being permanent. When Leland's trail camera appeared in the hollow in 2012, the camera was examined and redirected but not destroyed. The equipment was on the ground intact with the card in the slot, not smashed. When Cordell stood at the first bluff line in 2013 with binoculars, the Dogman stood in the shade and watched and did not advance. When the raiding coyote appeared in 2019, the problem was resolved without anyone on the ridge being told to do anything, and the resolution was communicated through placement. Every response across nearly 90 years has been proportionate to the specific situation, minimally intrusive to the ridge families and non-escalating toward violence. That consistency across time and across the varying situations that 9 decades of shared proximity produces is not instinct. It is consistent, long-term strategic behavior. The Boston Mountains were Cherokee hunting territory for centuries before European contact. Before the Cherokee moved into the Arkansas Ozarks, the Boston Mountains and the surrounding territory were part of the broader range of the Osage Nation, a people whose territory in the 18th century covered an enormous swath of what is now Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. The Osage were displaced westward by a combination of Cherokee settlement, colonial pressure, and the treaty-making process of the early American Republic, and their presence in the Boston Mountains was substantively reduced by the time the Cherokee arrived. But the Osage oral tradition, as documented by historians and anthropologists working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, contains its own body of knowledge about the beings that inhabited specific pieces of ground in this region. Knowledge organized around a different spiritual and taxonomic framework than the Cherokee tradition, but arriving at overlapping practical conclusions about which kinds of places required particular respect and what the response to an encounter at those places should be. The Osage wolf medicine tradition, which associated specific spiritual power with beings that combined wolf and human attributes, was among the elements of Osage culture that survived removal and colonization into the 20th century, and was recorded by ethnographers who worked in Osage communities in Oklahoma in the decades after the turn of the century. The Western Cherokee, often called the Old Settlers, the group that relocated voluntarily to Arkansas in the years following the 1794 Treaty of Tellico before the forced removal, hunted the upper Buffalo watershed and the ridges of the Boston Mountains through the first decades of the 19th century. Their relationship to this terrain was built on a system of knowledge about the landscape that went far deeper than the settler families who came after them, and that knowledge took specific account of what the landscape contained. The forced removal of 1838, the Envenenadala TSV, the trail where they cried, ended the Western Cherokee's formal presence in the Arkansas Ozarks. The removal was conducted across the winter months of 1838 and 1839, moving approximately 16,000 people across terrain that was brutal in the best conditions and lethal in the conditions of that particular winter. Estimates of the death toll range from 4,000 to 8,000 people, with the highest mortality among the elderly and young children who lacked the physical reserve to sustain the march in cold that dropped well below freezing for extended periods. The Western Cherokee, the old settlers who had made the voluntary move decades earlier, were by then established in Indian Territory west of Arkansas and received the forced removal survivors into a community that was already structured. They carried their traditions with them, the oral history of the Boston Mountain terrain, the knowledge of what lived in the hollow bottoms and the spring sites, the protocols for navigating those places safely, came west with the people who held it. But the oral traditions they carried about this terrain did not end with the removal. The Eastern Cherokee, who remained in North Carolina and who maintained a parallel set of traditions developed in the same mountain culture, were documented extensively by the ethnographer James Mooney beginning in the 1890s. Mooney's fieldwork, published in his 1897 monograph Myths of the Cherokee, provides the most complete available record of Cherokee traditions about the beings that inhabited specific territories in the mountain landscape. Mooney worked in the field between 1887 and 1890, living in Cherokee communities in the Smoky Mountain country of western North Carolina, and his documentation is among the most thorough of any 19th-century ethnographic project. He was a rigorous recorder. He distinguished consistently between mythological narrative, origin story, and what his informants presented as historical account, the record of things that had happened to specific people at specific places. He was not credulous, but he was also not dismissive. He recorded what he was told in the categories his informants assigned to it, with enough fieldwork context to give the distinctions meaning. The Cherokee world, as Mooney recorded it, was populated by a range of beings that occupied the landscape alongside humans and commanded different responses depending on their nature and their location. Among the beings Mooney documented were those associated with specific hollow bottoms and spring sites, territorial presences that did not have a single categorical name, but that the Cherokee recognized as demanding avoidance and respect. He recorded multiple accounts of Cherokee hunters encountering beings at spring sites in remote hollows that match the general description. Large, capable of bipedal movement associated with a specific piece of ground and responding to human intrusion not with aggression but with a warning behavior that established the boundary without a violent confrontation. These accounts were presented in Mooney's documentation as historical rather than mythological, things that had happened to specific people in specific places, not stories told to explain the landscape, but records of encounters with beings the Cherokee treated as real inhabitants of the terrain. The Western Cherokee who hunted the Boston Mountains of Newton County had access to the same tradition. What they knew about specific hollow bottoms and spring sites in that terrain is not directly recorded because the removal disrupted the community before systematic documentation was possible. But the structural parallel between what Mooney recorded from Eastern Cherokee informants about spring site encounters and what the Cutter Ridge families have experienced across 4 generations is worth taking seriously. The Cherokee recognized territorial beings at spring sites in remote hollows. The Cutter Ridge Hollow has a spring at its base. The protocol the Ridge families maintain, distance and respect in exchange for safety, is structurally identical to the protocol the Cherokee maintained for the same kind of encounter. Either the Ridge families independently arrived at an identical response to an identical experience, or the experience itself is the same experience, ongoing in that hollow. Across the centuries between the Cherokee presence in those mountains and the settler families who came after them. Linda Godfrey has been collecting Dogman reports since the early 1990s, when her coverage of the Bray Road sightings in Walworth County, Wisconsin brought the phenomenon into public discussion for the first time in any systematic way. She was a reporter at the time, working the county beat, which meant she was trained to interview people carefully and to separate what a witness had actually said from what would make the best story. The Walworth County reports came to her not as a story she was chasing, but as information residents were bringing to the county paper, and she processed them as a reporter processes unusual information. By interviewing the sources directly, asking the specific questions about detail and timeline and circumstances that determine whether an account is internally consistent, and by comparing accounts across witnesses who had no knowledge of each other's experiences. What she found was a level of consistency that her reporting instincts told her could not be easily explained as collective fabrication, and she followed that finding for the next 3 decades. Her work across 3 decades established the behavioral profile that has held up across hundreds of subsequent cases in the Great Lakes and beyond. 6 to 8 feet tall, dark fur, canine skull with elongated muzzle and upright ears, amber eye shine, bipedal with hands rather than paws, capable of quadrupedal movement, associated with water sources and remote terrain, displaying conscious restraint in encounters with humans. Godfrey's case files span Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and into the Deep South, and the cross-state consistency of the physical description across witnesses who have never communicated with each other is, she has argued, the core of the evidentiary value of the collective record. A physical description that varies as much as witness perception and memory vary is expected when different people are seeing different things. A physical description that remains consistent down to specific details, including the amber eye shine color, the elongated muzzle profile, the disproportionately long arms, and the bipedal stride, across witnesses in different states who have no knowledge of each other's experiences, implies that the different witnesses are seeing the same thing. That profile matches what the Cutter Ridge families describe as completely as anything in the published research. Godfrey's core finding across her case files was the pattern she called chosen restraint, the consistent documented choice by Dogman to warn rather than attack, to enforce territorial boundaries through demonstration of capability rather than direct violence, to let humans leave rather than prevent their departure. In the cases she documented across Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and into Kentucky and Appalachia, the creatures she studied showed a remarkable consistency in this approach. Warnings escalated in response to the degree of intrusion. Complete avoidance of violence when the human complied with the warning. And a territorial logic that treated the encounters not as predation events but as boundary negotiations, with the creature operating as the established party and the human as the trespasser being informed of their status. The Cutter Ridge material mirrors this pattern exactly. It does so across a time span longer than any single location case Godfrey documented, which is part of what makes it distinctive. Single encounter cases show the behavior in one moment. The Cutter Ridge record shows the behavior maintained consistently across nearly 90 years of proximity with the same human community. It is not just that the Dogman responded to Grover's intrusion in 1936 in the way Godfrey's behavioral model would predict. It is that the Dogman has continued to respond to every situation that has arisen on that ridge in the subsequent 9 decades in the same measured, proportionate, non-escalating way. That depth of consistency is what makes the case analytically significant rather than anecdotally interesting. Steve Cook was a radio disc jockey at WTCM in Traverse City, Michigan when he recorded a song in April of 1987 as an April Fool's prank. He had no research background and no prior knowledge of any Dogman tradition. He wrote the song in an afternoon, working from his own imagination and from a set of invented parameters he chose because they gave the premise internal consistency. A 10-year cycle tied to years ending in 7. A first sighting in Wexford County in 1887. A physical description drawn from no source except his own sense of what would sound plausible and frightening in the context of a northern Michigan radio bit. He recorded it, played it on the air, and waited for people to call and say they got the joke. He called it the legend. He invented the Michigan Dogman entirely, the 10-year appearance cycle, the first sighting in Wexford County in 1887. It was intended as a joke. After it aired, the station received hundreds of calls from people who had seen exactly what the song described. Some of these were people playing along with a radio bit, and Cook knew that, but the ones that were not playing along were impossible to miss, because they carried details the song had not included, specific road locations, specific dates that went back years and in some cases decades before the broadcast, physical descriptions that diverged from the song's intentionally general language in ways that were consistent with each other but not with what Cook had written. A person playing along with a radio bit does not call in with a date from 12 years before the broadcast in a specific location that they ask not to be publicly identified. Cook understood the difference and took the calls that carried that quality seriously. By the time he had heard 24 of those calls, he had stopped thinking about what he had created and started thinking about what he had uncovered. Farmers, hunters, loggers, people who had been carrying their experiences in silence for years because they had no word for them and no framework that would make anyone believe them. The song gave them a word and gave them permission to use it. Cook spent years afterward collecting those reports, which eventually numbered in the thousands, and the consistency he found across witnesses who had never communicated with each other. The same height, the same head shape, the same amber eyes, the same bipedal walk, the same territorial behavior, was something Cook himself described as impossible to dismiss as cultural transmission or collective fabrication. Grover's notebook page was written in 1936. The Perlman incident with the hounds was in the spring of 1937. The first of the vocal events Olin's grandfather described predates the Steve Cook song by at least 40 years. Whatever the Cutter Ridge Hollow contains, it predates every cultural moment that has made Dogman a recognizable concept, and the families who documented it had no concept of Dogman as a category and no interest in any of the frameworks that would later develop around it. They wrote down what was in their hollow and established rules for living beside it because the thing was there, and the rules were necessary, and that was the entirety of their motivation. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission manages wildlife resources across Newton County's terrain with professional competence. They survey deer and turkey populations, monitor the elk herd in the buffalo watershed carefully as an ongoing conservation achievement, and run standard predator monitoring protocols across the state. Their field staff are experienced biologists and wardens who know what belongs in this terrain and how to document it. The framework they work within does not include the category that the Cutter Ridge material would require, and this is not a failure of competence. It is a structural limit. The Commission's wildlife reporting database has fields for every species that has been documented in Arkansas. It does not have a field for a large bipedal canine-headed being of 7 to 8 feet that has held a defined hollow territory in Newton County for the better part of a century. Creating that field would require a chain of institutional acknowledgments beginning with a field officer writing a report that uses his professional credentials to document a finding his agency has no category for. Going to a supervisor who sends it to a regional director who flags it to agency leadership, and ending with someone at the commission being the first state wildlife official in Arkansas to formally acknowledge an undocumented large predator in the Boston Mountains. No one in that chain wants to be the link where the acknowledgement happens. So the chain stays intact, and the category stays absent. This is not conspiracy. It is the entirely rational behavior of professionals inside institutions that are not built for information that does not fit their classification architecture. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from understanding a system's structural limits clearly enough to know that working within the system would produce exactly the wrong result. Leland has that frustration in a mild form, not bitter, not directed at any individual in the wildlife management apparatus, but present. The field officers he has dealt with over the years on matters of cattle predation and fence line disputes have been professional and fair. He has no complaint about the people. His complaint, if it can be called that, is about the architecture. If Leland called the commission tomorrow and described the trail camera clip and the track cast and the coyote at the fence post, a field officer would probably come out within a few weeks. They would look at the evidence. They would file a report in the system's wildlife encounter category as a large bear producing unusual track impressions and unusual behavior because that is the nearest available category. And because writing anything else in the report would require the officer to stake their professional credibility on a finding their agency does not have a category for. The information would enter the system in the wrong category and stay there, and nothing would follow. Leland understands this. He said it without bitterness. He said the wildlife professionals in this part of the state do good work with the species they manage, and that work matters to him directly. The elk recovery in the Buffalo watershed has been one of the better things to happen to Newton County in the past 40 years. The category problem is real, but not his to solve. What the rule costs the Ridge families is not always obvious from outside. Leland talked about the cost in the plainest possible terms, as someone who has accepted a loss talks about it after enough time has passed that the acceptance is complete. It is not a loss he grieves, but it is a loss he can quantify, and he did. The economic cost is real. 70-plus acres on Leland's property alone, productive Boston mountain timber and hollow habitat, generate no income and cannot be used for any purpose requiring human entry. The timber value of those acres in standing volume across a forest that has not been harvested in over 9 decades is substantial. The cedars below the first bluff alone represent a merchantable volume that would take a logging crew several days to work. He has never had it estimated officially because doing so would require explaining to a forester why the ground cannot be accessed, and that explanation is not one he is prepared to have. The hunting lease value of that ground would be significant in a county where deer hunting is both a cultural cornerstone and a meaningful source of income for landowners with wooded acreage. The timber value is real. None of it is accessible. Leland said he did the rough math on what the hollow could be worth one time when he was a younger man trying to figure out whether the cattle operation made sense as a long-term enterprise. He looked at the numbers and then put the calculator away. The harder cost is the social one. In Newton County, land is identity. People know what you own and whether you work it. A man who has 70 acres of prime timber and does not cut it, does not hunt it, does not lease it, and has in fact never set foot on it in his adult life, people notice that. They notice it without saying anything directly because rural Arkansas is not a culture of direct questions about a man's land management decisions. But they notice, and the explanation available to Leland that the hollow is off limits because of what his grandfather saw there in the fall of 1936 is not an explanation that opens the conversation. It closes it. So Leland tells people the hollow has drainage problems. He says the limestone makes it impractical for any productive use. He says some ground is just for the deer and that is all right with him. He has been saying variations of this for 30 years. He is good at it now. Cordell's cost was different and more acute. He was a professional hunter whose entire livelihood depended on his reputation for putting clients on animals in reliable terrain. After what he saw through the binoculars on the first bluff, he could not return to the Boston Mountains without thinking about it. He tried, in the season after the incident, to take clients into other parts of Newton County, public ground in the Ozark National Forest, private land in different terrains south of Jasper. He could not sustain it. The confidence he had built over 15 years of guiding in that specific mountain environment was gone, not because his knowledge was gone, but because his knowledge had been revised by one afternoon on a bluff line with binoculars. He knew the deer and the turkey and the land's topography and the stand positions that produced. He had not known what lived in the hollow on the west end of Cutter Ridge, and not knowing it had put him in a situation he was not equipped to handle. He moved his operation south and started over. He is doing all right in the new territory. He does not discuss why he left the Boston Mountains. Olin's cost is of a different kind, paid across a longer span. He has lived on his ridge for more than 8 decades. In that time, he has been through things that the ridge and the surrounding community have also been through. The slow departure of most of the younger generation in the decades after the war. The years when the county's economic decline was severe enough that families who had farmed the same ground for 2 and 3 generations sold and left. The seasons when the cattle prices were bad enough that running the operation required a supplemental income from somewhere, and there was no easy somewhere available. He has outlasted most of his contemporaries on that ridge. The community he grew up in, the tight-knit social world of families who needed each other for the practical work of living in rough terrain, has been reduced to a smaller version of itself, held together by the families that stayed and by the occasional new arrival, who came looking for the remoteness rather than despite it. He is the most thoroughly acquainted of any living person with what is in the hollow. He has heard it 3 times. He has watched the rule function across his entire lifetime, watched it protect his family and his neighbors across time that exceeds most institutional memories. He believes in the rule the way a person believes in a physical law, not because someone told him to, but because he has seen it operate. What he pays is in the silence. He grew up in a community where people in the mountains talked about what they found in the field. Wildlife observations were shared information, the common currency of a hunting and farming culture built on collective knowledge of what the land contained. Olin has more knowledge of what his local land contains than anyone in his community, and it is the one piece of knowledge he cannot share. He has kept it to himself for 8 decades. Leora has known it for over 50 years and has kept it the same way. His children know there is a rule about the West End. They know not to go past the second bluff. They do not carry the full account because Olin has not given it to them. He was not sure he had the right to put that on people who had not chosen to seek it out. He told me near the end of our conversation that when I asked whether he ever regretted being born on that ridge, he was quiet for a moment and then said no. He said the ridge is his home. He said the hollow is part of his home the way a storm cellar is part of a farm. It exists, it has its purpose, and you do not go into it when you do not need to. He has lived a full and decent life on that ridge, and his family has never been harmed. And he does not see how the knowledge he carries has made his life worse than the alternative of not having it. He said not knowing in a place like this does not mean being safer. It means being less informed. In October of 2021, 3 days after a substantial rain had left the mud around Leland's stock pond in ideal condition for holding impressions, he found prints. He was checking the pond in the early morning before the cattle came down from the upper field, a routine he ran in the wet seasons to assess whether the pond margins needed any work before the ground froze. The light was flat and gray, and the air was cold enough to see his breath. He found the first impression at the east rim of the pond where the clay bank slopes gently down to the waterline, and he stopped walking and looked at it without bending toward it for a full 30 seconds, making himself catalog what he was seeing before his body responded to what he was feeling. Then he went around the pond on the uphill side, away from the rim, to see whether the circuit continued without adding his own boot marks to the substrate. He had found prints at the pond before in 2015 and had photographed them and spent 2 weeks trying to identify the species before accepting that he could not, and filing the photographs in the same folder on his desktop where he kept the trail camera clip and the images of the bent bracket. The 2015 prints had been ambiguous. He could see enough to know they were wrong for bear and wrong for human, but not enough to be certain of the full shape. The 2021 prints were not ambiguous. They came in from the south along the pond's eastern rim. The substrate was silty clay with a thin leaf layer over it, and the impressions were clear through the leaves into the clay below. Bipedal. 2 feet only, no forelegs. The gait pattern of something traveling upright with its weight forward of center, distributed toward the toes rather than the heel. The same posture the trail camera clip had implied 9 years earlier through the figure's stride and forward lean. The step length between consecutive impressions was between 4 feet and 4.5 feet. He paced it out. He measured it. No human being of normal proportions walks at that stride length. He measured the individual print and got 9 inches long by 5.5 wide. He photographed everything: the full circuit, the individual prints, his boot beside the clearest impression for scale, and the 2 pause points from above and from the side to document the toe angle at each one. The photography took close to an hour. He ran out of battery on his phone camera and went back to the house for the spare battery and came back and finished. Then he mixed plaster of Paris in the 5-gallon bucket he kept in the barn for exactly this purpose, having acquired the habit of carrying casting supplies during a period years earlier when he was trying to document bobcat tracks for a neighbor who did not believe they were in the county. He poured the cast of the clearest print and let it set. The pour was not perfect because the clay substrate at the rim gave slightly in one corner and the print edge on that side blurred a little before the plaster set firm. The remaining 3 sides of the impression are clean and clear. The cast documents the heel pad, the ball, and the first 3 toe impressions fully. The outer 2 toes are partially rendered, the clay having given at the rim. It is enough. He has measured the cast more than once. The numbers are the numbers. That cast sits in his barn beside the bent mounting bracket from 2012. The circuit was the detail that stayed with him. The prints did not stop at the pond's edge to drink. They circled it, a complete circuit, stride consistent throughout, with 2 locations where the impressions were deeper through the toe area, suggesting the figure had paused and stood at those points. He identified the 2 pause points and stood at each one, orienting himself by the angle of the toe impressions to determine which direction the figure had been facing. The first pause point faced northeast, through the tree line in that direction, the ridgetop fields and the roof line of his barn. The second pause point faced northwest, through the field in that direction, the county road and the outline of the northwest property's house, visible on clear days. The figure had circled his stock pond and looked at the houses. Then it had walked back south toward the bluff line and the hollow below. He called Olin that morning and described what he had found. Olin was quiet for a moment and then said, "It's been up here before. You just haven't found the sign." Leland asked how he knew. Olin was quiet for a moment and then said the question was the wrong question in a way a short answer would not address. He said the thing in the hollow is not a visitor on that ridge. It is a resident. It has been a resident of that terrain since before the first family arrived, and it has maintained the same relationship to the ground it occupies that any resident maintains. It knows the territory. It knows what is in it, and it keeps the knowledge current. Olin said his grandfather used to say that the thing in the hollow made its rounds the way any working farmer makes his rounds, checking what is there, seeing what has changed, keeping the picture current. He said his grandfather believed it had been doing that since before the ridge was settled, and that the settlers had simply been added to what it was keeping track of. Leland went back to his house and he locked the door. He has lived on Cutter Ridge his whole life without locking doors. This is not an ideological position. It is simply how things are on a ridge that far from anything, where the neighbors you have are known and the strangers who come up the county road come there with business that announces itself. He locked it that night by reflex, a physical response before the reasoning caught up. He does not usually lock his door. He locked it that night and then stood in his kitchen thinking about what locking a door actually accomplished given what the tracks implied. Given that whatever had made the circuit of his stock pond could bend a steel camera bracket with one hand and carry a 40-pound coyote up a limestone bluff without leaving a drag mark. He stood there for a while, and the standing was useful. It gave him time to work through the arithmetic of the situation without the interference of a reaction he had not chosen. The lock was not going to hold anything that could bend a steel camera bracket. The distance from the hollow to the house was not a meaningful buffer for something that had circled his stock pond, which is 40 yards from the barn and 100 from the back porch, without his hearing it at any point during the circuit. If he had been on the porch that night, would he have heard it? He did not know. He knew that on the nights he had been on the porch and heard nothing, something might have been moving on the lower ridge with the same silence the track evidence implied. That thought was not comforting. He completed the arithmetic. Then he made coffee and he sat at the kitchen table with his phone and looked at the photographs he had taken at the pond. And he thought about his grandfather's notebook page and about the coyote at the fence post and about the bent bracket in the barn and about all the things that had not happened in 87 years on this ridge because of a rule that nobody had posted on a sign. No livestock killed, no person harmed, no night when the Ridge families went to bed uncertain about what was on the other side of the second bluff line. The certainty has been absolute for as long as the rule has held. And the rule has held because both sides understand what it is for. The ethical question Leland returned to most often across our conversations was not whether to release the footage. He had settled that well before agreeing to speak with me, and the answer was no, and it would remain no. He had spent a long time arriving at that answer, he said, because the younger version of himself, the version that had come back from Fayetteville with enough outside experience to be skeptical of anything he had not independently verified, would have given a different answer. The younger Leland believed in information. He believed that knowledge should move, that the system of science and institutional verification that organized the broader world was, if imperfect, better than the alternative of information staying locked inside individual families on individual ridges forever, unverified and unshared. He held that belief until the trail camera clip. After the clip, he spent several months working through the logical chain that followed from actually releasing it, and every path he followed ended in the same place. The reasons were the same reasons every credible person who holds this kind of documentation eventually arrives at. He holds it. It does not go further than what he chooses to share in a controlled conversation like this one, with identifying details stripped and specific locations undisclosed. He will not post the trail camera clip. He will not submit the trackcast to a wildlife researcher. He will not contact Godfrey's research network, though he knows it exists. Whatever value the documentation might have to the research community is outweighed by the risk that public knowledge creates. The risk is specific, and he can describe it precisely. Newton County has a resident hunting community and a growing number of non-resident hunters who come for the deer and the elk and the turkey. The Boston Mountain terrain is accessible by county road and old logging track to anyone with a vehicle and the willingness to push into rough country. If the Cutter Ridge material became public and the trail camera clip circulated, and Leland knows how quickly these things circulate, then the hunting community would have a target to look for. Some of the people who came looking would come with cameras and careful intentions, documenting without intruding. Others would come with guns and the confidence that comes from never having been in those woods, and they would push past the second bluff line with the certainty that no rule about a hollow on private land had any authority over them. The ridge terrain is not a wilderness in the regulatory sense. It is private land with county road access and no posted prohibition beyond what the families themselves maintain. Anyone who wanted to go into that hollow could go into it. The law does not protect the hollow, and the rule does not have the force of law. What protects the hollow is the fact that nobody outside the ridge community knows the rule is there, which means nobody outside the ridge community has a specific reason to push past the second bluff line with the confidence of someone who believes they are going to find what they came for. That obscurity is the protection. Release the footage, and the obscurity ends. And then the arrangement that has protected 4 generations of families on that ridge, and that has been maintained by an intelligence that has shown nothing but patience and restraint across 9 decades, would be over. because the restraint is conditional. The condition is that the boundary is respected. If the boundary stops being respected, the restraint stops being the relevant behavior. Leland thought about what a confrontation between a 7 to 8 foot territorial predator on its home ground and an unprepared hunter who pushed past the bluff line would look like, and what the investigation that followed would look like, and what the consequences would be for the Hollow and for the Ridge families and for the thing that had kept the peace for nearly a century. He said none of the outcomes in that sequence were good for anyone. The arrangement works because both sides hold it. Remove the restraint from either side and the arrangement does not exist anymore, so the clip stays in the folder on his laptop. The track cast stays in the barn. The bent bracket stays on the shelf beside it. And the hollow below the second bluff line stays what it has been since Grover settled on the ridge in the late 1920s, occupied, observed, and left alone. Newton County has fewer people per square mile than it has had in 100 years. The timber economy that drove settlement in the Boston Mountains in the late 1800s has not returned since the big company logging left. The ridgetop farms are small operations run by families that have been on the same land long enough to understand it on its own terms. The Ozark National Forest on 3 sides of the ridge provides a buffer of public land that is hunted in season and largely empty the rest of the year. There is no cell service on the ridge. The nearest emergency services are 30 minutes away in good weather, and considerably more in the wet seasons when the county roads go soft. Cutter Ridge is, in the terms that matter for what lives in that hollow, genuinely remote. Not remote in the wilderness sense, you can see a neighbor's light from your porch and the county road is there. But remote enough that something large and intelligent and determined to maintain its territorial privacy can do exactly that. Across seasons and across decades without the kind of continuous human attention that documentation and disclosure would bring. The Dogman in the hollow below the second bluff line is still there. Leland has heard vocalizations twice in the years since he found the pond tracks in 2021. Both times in October. Both times at night on the porch after the workday was done, in the clear, cold air of a Boston mountain autumn. He describes the experience of hearing it now with a different quality than he imagines he would have described it before the pond tracks. Before the tracks, the vocalizations were strange but distant, a fact of the ridge's background that he had grown up adjacent to without fully integrating. After the tracks, the knowledge that whatever made the sound had been above the bluff line, had circled his stock pond, had stood at the north edge of the pond and looked in the direction of his barn, transformed the distance. The sound from the hollow is the same sound it has always been. The knowledge of what kind of attention accompanies it is different. He sits on the porch and he listens, and he does not pretend to himself that sitting on the porch is the same activity it was before October of 2021. It is the same chair, the same cold, the same October dark on the ridge. Something has changed in the information he brings to it. Both times coming from the direction of the hollow, deep in the lower ground below the bluff lines. He sits on his porch and he listens the way Olin's grandfather sat with his rifle across his knees and listened, not afraid, just attentive, acknowledging a message that is not addressed to him personally, but that concerns the ridge they share. The message is always the same. It's there. It does that sometimes. The last time I spoke with Leland was in late November. A Thursday afternoon when the Boston Mountains would have been in full late autumn mode. The last of the leaves down, the ridgelines bare, the sky the uniform gray of an Ozark overcast settling in for weeks. He was done with the cattle work for the day and had a few minutes on the porch before dark came in. He talked about the coming winter, about the forecast, about a fence line on the north side of the property that needed attention before spring. He talked as a man talks when he has given you the significant thing and wants now to return to the texture of the ordinary life that contains it. I let him. And then he came back to it. as he always came back to it not because he was searching for more to say, but because the subject had a gravity that drew him back. The hollow makes its sounds in October, and he has stopped being surprised by this. October is the turn point of the year in the Boston Mountains, the month when the ridges shift from green to bare, when the deer move and the elk come down from the high ground and the cold air arrives from the north without warning and stays. It is also the month when the hollow is most active. He does not know whether the seasonality is tied to the rut cycle or to something else entirely. He does not know whether the vocal events of October represent a heightened territorial communication or a response to the increased human activity in the forest that the hunting season brings. He only knows that October is when it speaks most often, and that in each of the Octobers since the pond tracks in 2021, he has stood on his porch in the dark and heard it at least once. The sound has not changed in the years he has been hearing it. In the dark of an October night on Cutter Ridge, it sounds like something that has been there a very long time and intends to stay. When Leland finally agreed to speak with me, the first thing he wanted me to understand was that he was not asking for anyone to go look. He was not seeking investigation or validation or any engagement from outside the Ridge community. He was telling the story because it is true and because somewhere in the telling the document of the Ridge becomes something more permanent than a family oral tradition that might not transmit cleanly to the next generation. He thinks about the day the Ridge passes to his children and to the children of his neighbors, and about whether the knowledge will transfer the way it needs to transfer, the way the old woman transferred it in the courthouse parking lot. The way Olin's grandfather transferred it by sitting on the porch with a rifle until the message from the hollow was finished, and then offering the only explanation that mattered. It's letting us know it's there. The rule is not a burden. He said it is a responsibility. He said he thinks about Grover backing up the slope in October of 1936 with his eyes on the thing at the spring. And he thinks about all the seasons that have turned on that ridge since that afternoon, while the families above and the Dogman below have maintained the distance that makes it possible for both of them to be there. He understands that he inherited something from Grover that is not the land. The land is part of it, 140 acres of Boston Mountain Ridge that he works as his father and grandfather worked it before him, managing the cattle and the hay and the timber on the east and north portions in the same cycles the land has been managed in for close to 100 years. But the land without the knowledge that comes with it would be a different inheritance. A man who owned that land without knowing what was in the hollow below the second bluff would be a man in a situation he was not equipped to manage, either stumbling into the confrontation that Wyatt stumbled into or living adjacent to something he had no framework for, and that his framework would eventually lead him to challenge. The knowledge is what makes the land manageable. The knowledge is what makes the arrangement possible. He said he understands that he inherited something from Grover that is not the land. The land is part of it. But the real inheritance is the knowledge of how to live on the land alongside what has been there longer. He said that is not a small thing to inherit, and he does not intend to be the generation that loses it. The hollow is still below the second bluff. The spring still surfaces through the limestone fracture the way it has for geological time, the water cold in every season. The limestone in that part of Newton County was laid down in the Mississippian period roughly 330 million years ago, when the region lay under a shallow tropical sea. The fossils that the bluff faces expose where the rock is fractured and weathered are sea creatures, crinoids, and brachiopods, and the occasional corals of a warm ocean that has not existed in this part of the world for 300 million years. The spring water moving through those rock formations has been in contact with that geological time across its passage through the deep rock, and it arrives at the surface carrying the temperature and the mineral content of a world enormously older than the ridge above it, enormously older than any human presence in the Boston Mountains, older by orders of magnitude than the rule and the hollow and the 90 years of arrangement between the families on the ridge and the intelligence that holds the ground below them. That context does not diminish the human story, but it places it. The white oaks on the slope are larger now than they were in Grover's time. The cedar thicket below the bluff line is thicker. 9 decades of seasons have moved through that hollow since Grover came down through the first bluff line in October of 1936 and found what he found at the pool. 9 decades of winters and springs and the turn of the Ozark summer into fall. The leaves going and the ground freezing and the spring running and the leaves coming back. And in all that time, below the second bluff line, the terms of occupancy have not changed. The arrangement is as current as it was the morning Grover sat down at his kitchen table and did not pick up his rifle again for the rest of that season. There is a fact worth sitting with that the oldest and most stable territorial arrangement in the Boston Mountains of Newton County, the one that has held the longest without a documented violation from either party, is the one between the families on Cutter Ridge and the intelligence in their hollow that no wildlife agency has ever catalogued. Every other territorial relationship in that landscape has been renegotiated by human pressure at some point across the past 100 years. The elk were removed and then restored. The black bear population was reduced to low numbers by hunting pressure and has been slowly recovering under management. The white-tailed deer population has cycled up and down in response to harvest pressure and habitat change, and the disease events that move through ungulate populations in cycles of their own. All of these are managed relationships maintained through ongoing human intervention, and all of them have been altered significantly at least once in the past century by human decisions operating within institutional frameworks. The arrangement on Cutter Ridge has not been altered once. It has not required intervention by any agency or institution. It has maintained itself through the mutual behavior of the two parties to it, without contracts, without enforcement mechanisms, without any documentation in any system that any institution manages. It is, in that sense, the most durable wildlife arrangement in Newton County, and it is the one that the wildlife management apparatus has no knowledge of and no role in maintaining, while the broader ecosystem has been managed and mismanaged, while the elk have been removed and reintroduced, while the black bears have declined and recovered, while the Ozark National Forest has been drawn and redrawn on the map, and the county roads have been built and in some places reclaimed by the forest, the hollow below the second bluff line has remained exactly what it was when Grover found it, occupied, defined, protected by a rule that travels with the land the way a mineral right travels, binding on every owner in succession, enforced not by any court but by the consistent intelligence that holds the ground below the bluff line and has never needed to escalate past a warning to make its position clear. The ridge is still there. The rule is still there. Leland still wakes before sunrise to feed the cattle. Olin still sits on his east-facing porch in the morning when the weather allows. The county road still climbs its switchbacks from Highway 21 to the ridge top, gaining elevation through the limestone switchbacks in the same curves it has held since the county graded it. The Boston Mountains around the ridge are the same mountains they were when Grover came up that road in the late 1920s with a wife and 2 children, and a plan to make something work on ground the timber companies had left behind. The elk graze the Boxley bottomland in the mornings, and the deer run the ridge timber at dusk, and the screech owls work the hollow edges on October nights. And all of it is ordinary. And all of it is the background against which the hollow below the second bluff line remains what it has always been. The hollow is still below it, and the second bluff line marks the same boundary it has always marked, the edge of what belongs to the families on the ridge and the beginning of what belongs to what was there before them and will remain when they are gone. The Boston Mountains go on past the ridge in every direction, the limestone and the cedar and the dark hollows and the cold springs, all of it holding what it has always held, indifferent to the maps and the management plans and the category systems of every institution that has ever claimed authority over it. The maps do not note what is in the hollow. The management plans do not account for the territory below the second bluff line. The category systems have no field for what the trail camera clip shows or what the track cast documents or what the bent bracket on Leland's barn shelf implies. The landscape knows this and does not care. The Boston Mountains existed before the institutions and will exist after them. And what lives in the hollow below Cutter Ridge has maintained its claim on that ground across every map revision and every management plan cycle and every category system revision that has occurred in the decades since Grover came down through the first bluff line in October of 1936 and found what he found at the pool. The ground is old. The thing in the hollow is older. And the rule is, by now, older than most of the people who follow it can remember a time before. That is not a small thing for a rule with no legal standing, no posted sign, and no enforcement mechanism beyond the understanding of the families who carry it. It persists because what it describes persists. And what it describes shows no indication of going anywhere.